On this Friday episode of the Locked On Predators podcast, we'll answer 3 questions about Steven Stamkos and discuss the realistic odds of the veteran having a bounce back season.
You're Locked On Predators, your daily podcast on the Nashville Predators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Predators podcast. Thanks for making us your first listen of the day. We are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to kick off our You Made It to Friday episode shouting out our Locked On Predators insiders and our everydayers who tune in to talk Nashville Predators hockey with us. I'm Ann Kimmel. I am a writer and co-host with Penalty Box Radio. I am usually joined by my partner in crime, Emma Lingen, but Emma is off today, so I am flying solo. But we are wrapping up our week with our 3 questions about series. And today we are asking 3 questions about Steven Stamkos. A year ago at this time, we thought we had a pretty good idea of what the Predators were getting with newly acquired Steven Stamkos, but we all know things did not go as planned in the 24-25 season. Today, we're going to talk about what a bounce back season would look like by the numbers, what he's going to need around him to succeed, and what happens if Steven Stamkos doesn't bounce back. Plus, we are going to wrap up our week together having a conversation about one of Locked On Predators' favorite and probably most trustworthy young players. Before we dive into all of that on today's show, I do want to let you know today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, we are wrapping up a little series we call 3 questions about Barry Trotz, Andrew Burnett, and today we are asking and answering 3 questions about Steven Stamkos. So question 1, we're just going for it right out of the gate, friends. What would a bounce back season look like for Steven Stamkos? Well, friends, first, let's look at what last season was for Steven Stamkos. If you don't remember, because it was 84 years ago, it was not an ideal season for Steven Stamkos statistically or otherwise. Last season, he did play 82 games, 27 goals, 53 points. Now, to put that in perspective, it doesn't sound too shabby for the Nashville Predators to have a player with 27 goals, but Steven Stamkos' 82-game career average, 41 goals, 83.8 points per season. That is his career average. So significantly under his career average performance for his first season with the Nashville Predators. Now, of course, I know what some of you are saying. You're saying, well, yeah, but now it's Steven Stamkos who is aging. This is not young and perky Steven Stamkos. He is 35 years old. He's going to turn 36 in February. First of all, remember what I always say, age is not a disease. Also, if you look at Steven Stamkos when he played at 33-34 in Tampa Bay in the 2023-24 season, this was a player who played 79 games of that season, still had 40 goals, had 81 points. So the idea that all of the sudden, in 1 year, Steven Stamkos has fallen off of the geriatric cliff is just not statistically accurate. And it's also a little offensive to us older people. Now, we do know that Nashville has to get better out of Steven Stamkos. He absolutely has to have a bounce back season. And friends, there are a couple of components to what that could look like for Stamkos. There are on ice and off ice components to Stamkos getting back to Steven Stamkos form. What that looks like off ice. And these are things that we have talked about over the course of the season. These are things we've talked about in the off season. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but here is what Steven Stamkos needs to have off the ice to help him get a bounce back season. And I think one of the most important things is an ability to have open and honest conversations with coaches, with teammates, with the leadership group. He needs to feel 100% comfortable in that locker room, speaking up, listening, bringing in his ideas, pushing back when he needs to. He also has to just have peace about his situation. And, Stamkos was very excited to come to Nashville, but that wasn't his plan. And I think this is the season where he's had some time and he needs to really hit the ice with peace about his professional situation and just really a commitment to make some magic happen here in Nashville. And of course, I'm not implying by any means of saying that he wasn't all in last season, but last season was a tough, tough season for Steven Stamkos off the ice. And I've said this before, those of you who are regular listeners, my family moved a pretty big distance away, completely left one community when we had young kids for my husband's job. Different job than professional athlete. But you just can't underestimate how challenging of a life change that is, not just for the adults in the situation, but kids at, the Stamkos family age when they moved, they had already started kind of forming their communities. They'd already sort of dipped their toes in friendships. And it's hard as a parent to uproot your kids when you see that they have this community forming. You also have to remember, just from Steven Stamkos's perspective, Tampa Bay is all he has ever known as an adult. That's where he basically grew up. He was also the face of that franchise. If you, again, are a longtime listener, a great friend of the show, Deandra Liu, covers Tampa Bay Lightning for the NHL Network and a number of different media outlets. And she had reached out to me midway through the season and said, this is the impact Stamkos has in Tampa Bay. And it was a picture that a young fan had drawn like days before that of the Tampa Bay Lightning. And on the ice was Steven Stamkos, even though he was a Nashville Predator, but he was the face of that franchise. He was a captain of that franchise. So there's a lot of off-ice changes. So getting comfortable and kind of settling in, I think, is going to help Steven Stamkos a lot when it comes to what happens off the ice. And off ice is something that we're going to put a pin in. We're going to actually circle back to that conversation in a little bit later in this episode. But let's talk about what bouncing back looks like on the ice for Steven Stamkos. And if I am laying out I can live with this scenario for Steven Stamkos, remember his 82 game career averages 83.8 points per season. I'm going to sleep fine at night if we can get Steven Stamkos back to 65 or 70 points in a season. And quite frankly, I'm not really sure how that divides up when it comes to assists and goals. A lot of that is going to depend on where he plays. We're going to circle back to that as well. But I do think it is realistic. And I think it should be reassuring to Nashville Predators fans if we can see Steven Stamkos get a 65-point season. 9 of his 17 professional seasons, he has had more than 65 points in that. Of the 8 seasons that he didn't, one was 2016-17 where he was injured. 2 of them were, of course, the COVID-shortened seasons as well. So this is a player who can easily get a 65-point season, 70-point season. That would make a huge difference, because if Steven Stamkos is going, so many other things are going to snowball in the right way for the Nashville Predators. Friends, I'm not the only one who thinks that Steven Stamkos can bounce back successfully. Dauber Hockey had an article out earlier in the week. It's a great piece talking about the top 10 veterans who still bring real value. And number 3 on that list, Steven Stamkos. The author agrees. Look, this is a player who still has value. Last season, an anomaly. This season coming up, it's going to be that bounce back season. Now, does that mean he's going to be your 90 to 100 point player? I don't think Nashville is going to be the place where that's going to happen for him, but he can be the Steven Stamkos we thought we were getting when he was signed last offseason. Question 2 coming up that we are going to wrestle with when it comes to Steven Stamkos. If he's going to have a bounce back season, what does he need? We're going to talk about that coming right up. Today's episode is brought to you by our great friends at Game Time. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day, it's beautiful outside, and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. Friends, that is exactly where Game Time comes in. It is the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on things like food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you are to first pitch, and they've got incredible last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. If you're tired of endless scrolling trying to find the best deal, Game Time's Zone Deals pick the best seats in your section for you. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code Locked On NHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So I'm promising you a Steven Stamkos bounce back season. I'm not promising you anything. I'm saying I really, really think it's going to happen. But after last season, we're not promising anything. It's a sure he's going to have a bounce back season. But I do think it's possible. And I think there are certain things that Nashville can do for Steven Stamkos to get him back to form. The number one thing I think that has to happen this season with Steven Stamkos is you have to put him in the roster in the right spot, and then you have to leave him there. And for me and for Barry Trotz and for Steven Stamkos, he needs to be on the wing. Barry Trotz at his end of the season press conference, one of the things he talked about with Stamkos is that he really doesn't want him to play center. And that's a little bit tricky because if you look down the middle for the Nashville Predators, it is not a strong center lineup for the Preds. And Steven Stamkos is somebody who can step in. He can play center. He's got a tremendous amount of experience. But really, his position is on the wing, and you want him set up for that one-timer at 5-on-5 play. That is not just a power play special. That needs to be a 5-on-5 opportunity for Steven Stamkos. Now, Stamkos said at Locker Room Cleanout, we asked him about playing center versus playing wing, and he was actually pretty casual about it. He's like, hey, I'll play wherever. If they need me to play center, I am fine to play center. If, they want me on the wing, I'm fine to play wing. So I don't know that he necessarily feels strongly about this, but I'm going to tell you, I actually feel very strongly about this. Stamkos needs to be on the wing. Again, center depth, kiddie pool. We're talking Ryan O'Reilly is your 1C. You've got Fedor Svechkov stepping into an elevated role, likely at the 2C position. They just signed Eric Haula. They've got Michael McCarron, who has centered that fourth line for several seasons now. Not super strong down the middle, but this is what I'm going to say. Part of Stamkos being successful is playing him on the wing. And part of that means that Andrew Brunette is going to have to trust Fedor Svechkov at 2C. He's going to have to let him figure it out. And I feel like we can trust Svechkov. I feel like we saw some good growth from him last season. This is one of those times where if you want Steven Stamkos to be successful, you leave him on the wing. Quite frankly, I don't almost care who centers Stamkos, whether it is Ryan O'Reilly, whether it is Fedor Svechkov. Of course, you think he's going to be more successful with Ryan O'Reilly, but I love that you could put Stamkos with Svechkov, and that's a great opportunity for Svechkov. And I don't know that it's going to cost you a lot when it comes to numbers and production for Steven Stamkos as well. His numbers are not going to improve in a bubble. So we need to have the right position, and we also need to have the right line mates for Steven Stamkos. And this is something that I think we have to talk about, and we are repeating ourselves. Steven Stamkos has got to have consistent line mates. And again, I come back to, I don't really even care who they are. whether he is centered by Ryan O'Reilly, whether he is centered by Fedor Svechkov, whether he plays with Philip Forsberg or Jonathan Marchessault or a young player like a Luke Evangelista, I actually just don't care. I want Steven Stamkos to have consistent line mates. And again, there's a lot in the top 6 that you can wrestle with this team. Do you want to have Stamkos and a veteran with a young Fedor Svechkov? Is that going to be the best position for Svechkov to develop and for Stamkos to continue and up his production? That's something that they're going to have to wrestle with. It is bizarre and a little frightening that it is hard to nail down what the top 6 is definitely going to look like with the Nashville Predators, but they are going to have to nail that down pretty quickly in training camp, and they're going to have to let it ride. Do not be switching up. I know that Jonathan Marchessault is sort of credited as the player who spoke out about the line blender when he talked about after the Montreal game, I don't even know who I'm playing with in the course of a game. Everybody will benefit, including Steven Stamkos, with consistent line mates that you can begin to set expectations. You can begin to anticipate what is going to happen when you are playing together. And I think that that is going to be key in training camp. You have to sort out your top 6. And you have to let it ride, and I don't want to draw any conclusions that aren't there. I think it's going to be interesting to see where Stamkos ends up. Is he going to be on the top line with a Ryan O'Reilly? Is he going to be put, on the second line with Fedor Svechkov? And if so, what does that mean about what Barry Trotz is thinking big picture? Because on paper, in theory, you were going to get more from Stamkos with a veteran like Ryan O'Reilly. Or I wonder, is Barry Trotz saying, you know what? What's going to be most beneficial long-term is the development of Fedor Svechkov with a player like a Steven Stamkos, and Stamkos can still be successful there. So it's going to be interesting to see how that sorts out in training camp. But how it sorts out needs to be the way it plays out. Not a lot of line shifting. You've got to give this guy some consistent line mates. The other area where we need to see improvement, and that will help with Steven Stamkos getting back to, a bounce back season, getting back to where we expect him to be, he's got to feel it on the power play. And it takes a while. That sort of is his calling card. But he played with very specific players for a very long time and had that chemistry, had that anticipation. Last season, he really lost the opportunity to develop that partway through the season. I mean, the minute you lose Roman Josi quarterbacking the power play, the first power play unit, you lose the big picture of part of why you brought Steven Stamkos here. So you need a healthy Josi QBing that power play. Ryan O'Reilly, Steven Stamkos, Philip Forsberg, maybe Marchessault, maybe, and I'm just throwing this out here. We can talk about it another day. Maybe a little Luke Evangelista on power play 1. But you have to get the right combination on the power play. You need your best players to set Stamkos up for success on the power play, because that is where a lot of his numbers come from. Overall, the team needs to be better on the power play. The team has to be better at 5-on-5. This was one of the worst teams in the entire league scoring at 5-on-5. Steven Stamkos has to be a big part of improving that, which leads us into a little bit of an uncomfortable question number 3. Now, I'm telling you, I am banking on Steven Stamkos having a bounce back season. And by that, again, I come back to 65 to 70 point season, however that shakes out goals and assists. I really do think that's what's going to happen if he is set up for success. But let's just go to the place we don't want to go. What if Steven Stamkos doesn't have that bounce back season? Then what do the Nashville Predators do? That, my friends, is a little bit of a tricky conversation. And that's the question we're going to wrestle with. Question 3, what happens if Stamkos does not bounce back? Well, if Steven Stamkos and the Nashville Predators have a season similar to what they had last year, Barry Trotz has to face the reality that this is not a team that's going to contend. And we've talked about this in the Central Division for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 seasons. You have some clear teams in contend mode. Nashville has to be competitive with them. And if they have another season like they had last year, if Steven Stamkos has another season like he had last year, you know the Predators aren't going to be competitive for the next 2, 3, 5 seasons. They're going to need to do some growing of their young players. So what does that mean for a veteran like Steven Stamkos, who came to Nashville to win a cup, to compete for a cup, to go deep in the playoffs? What does that mean for him? Would the Nashville Predators move on from Steven Stamkos? There's a lot that goes into this, but basically the answer is, I don't know. Right now, Steven Stamkos has an $8 million cap hit through the 2028-29 season. And I know if you are a longtime Nashville Predators fan, you hear $8 million contract and you go, oh, that is not going to go well, because we just haven't had a lot of successful $8 million contracts. And we're actually still paying off 2 of those. But again, podcast for another day. Steven Stamkos has a no move clause. And what that means is that he cannot be traded. He cannot be sent to the minors. He cannot be waived without his permission. And that was a big part of the deal to bring Stamkos here, is he wanted that no move clause. He did not want to go through again what he went through in Tampa Bay. So what that means is that Steven Stamkos would have to agree and want to move on from the Predators. That's actually not super far-fetched. I talked about at locker room cleanout, Steven Stamkos was really open about, hey, I can play center. Hey, I can play on the wing. I'll play whatever you want. Here is what he was not super thrilled about, and that is sticking around through a rebuild, because he wants a chance to win again. He wants a chance to compete again. And he was pretty clear in body language, in inflection, as much as in words. That's a different conversation for Stamkos. Now, how is Nashville going to move on from this contract? That's a whole nother ball game. Of course, Stamkos likely would want to go back to Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay, they don't have a lot of money there. They've got their big guys signed through like 2030, 2031. So there's not a ton of space there. But here is what we know from past experience, a la Ryan McDonough. If Stamkos ain't happy here, Barry Trotz won't keep him. And that could mean that Nashville moves him to a place of Stamkos' choosing, and maybe Nashville has to retain salary. That's a little further down the road. So as we exit the topic of Steven Stamkos, here is what I want to say. Let's bank on Stamkos having a bounce back season. I don't think that this is a stretch to say that that's going to happen. Whether it happens with Andrew Brunette as the head coach for 82 games remains to be seen. And I'm not sure how much that's going to play into it. Stamkos has to have a bounce back season with consistent line mates in the right position. And he's got to be in the right place himself to be successful. I think that can happen. So while we may have been a little more less optimistic about Andrew Brunette or Barry Trotz, I will say I do feel optimistic that we are going to see better from Steven Stamkos, and therefore we are going to see better from the Nashville Predators next season. Coming up, we want to talk a little bit about a young player we are big fans of here at the Locked On Predators podcast. I want to have a frank discussion about Spencer Stastney and a recent interview he did with Elliot Friedman on the 32 Thoughts podcast. So I would love to have this discussion with Emma, and it may be something that we circle back to when she is back next week. So we may touch on this again, but it's something that felt important to me to talk about. Here at the Locked On Predators podcast, we are huge fans of Spencer Stastney, young defenseman for the Nashville Predators. We have loved his game, really liked his skill set for a long time. We also have been very frank in saying that we would allow him to do our taxes. He is what I refer to as the guy who's going to grow up to be the Dos Equis man, the most interesting man in the world. Finance and film double major from Notre Dame. He's just a really interesting human being, very talented hockey player. But last season, Spencer Stastney stepped away from hockey for a while. And really, we didn't get a lot of information about what that situation involved until Spencer Stastney went on the 32 Thoughts podcast and talked about his decision to step away from hockey and to deal with some issues that he was having on and off of the ice. Now, going back with us, we showed up on the first day of training camp, and we were told by the Nashville Predators staff, Spencer Stastney will not be reporting to camp for personal reasons. That's all that we knew at the time. Stastney went on and opened up and shared very vulnerably, very authentically what that meant on this interview with Elliot Friedman, and talked about the fact that he was battling anxiety and depression, and it manifested some on the ice, but it was about so much more than hockey. And I just want to encourage you to go back and listen to that podcast. I believe it was last Sunday's podcast, because I don't want to retell the story in my own words. Like, Spencer's story deserves to be told in his own words. And he does such a great job of talking about what was going on with him at the time and what led to the decision that he made to take a step back from hockey. And he entered the NHL Players Assistance Program. And if you are a longtime listener here, of course, we love Spencer Stastney, but we are also big believers. We are big partakers in the process of therapy. And this is something that Spencer Stastney talked about in this interview, just the value of going to therapy for him. And I want to say how much I appreciate Stastney being honest about how important that part of the process was for him, not about returning to the ice, but about finding health in his own life. And that is something that I think really was powerful as I listened to this episode, because we tend to think of hockey players with kind of that stereotypical, they're mentally tough and nothing phases them. And they just go out there and they do the job. But I think we have to remember that there is so much more to a player than what they do on the ice. And it's an interesting, just over the week, I've been chewing on this, and I'm kind of telling myself this as much as I'm sharing this with you all. But one of the things that's really tricky when you are a sports fan, when you are in sports media, is this dichotomy of recognizing that we have to talk about and we evaluate players based on production, that they are evaluated on what they do, because that is their job. Their job is to score goals, or their job is to stop goals. I just spent part of this podcast talking about Steven Stamkos and production and what he needs to do. And we can talk about it. Stamkos is being paid $8 million to do this job. That's more money than most of us will ever see in a lifetime. And so I think it's very easy to fall into conversations that are analyzing production, like stats, wins, losses, rankings, all of that, and turning that into a value statement about a person. And this conversation with Spencer Stastney really got me thinking about that. It is not so much about what players do. I mean, that's what we talk about, right? That's what we evaluate. And here we try to do it in an educational way. We try to do it in an entertaining way. But that is the job. That is what we do as fans of a team. That is what we do as we watch a sport. We evaluate production. But I think Stastney's conversation is that it was a good reminder that we have to hold in the same regard that we hold the production. We have to regard the who. Who is this person? And sometimes it's hard to do with elite athletes who, again, are paid a lot of money to do something that they're very good at. The only way I know how to compare this in my own life is going to sound weird, but I want you to go on this journey with me. Most of you know, if you're a longtime listener, my family raised sheep growing up. But also, my dad was a school teacher. He taught fourth grade for 35 years. And when my dad was a school teacher, my dad taught school every day, Monday through Friday, in a suit and tie. That was just what you did when my dad was teaching school. And even towards the end of his career, as teachers began wearing jeans and t-shirts, my dad still went to school every day in a suit and a tie. And I went in to visit him one day. I was home from college and I would pop into his classroom sometimes when I was home. And I had a kid pull me aside in the hallway. And he leaned in and he was like trying to get the scoop on something. And he said to me, "Are you Mr. Ekdahl's daughter?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Does he ever wear jeans?" And I remember having this moment of like, yeah, he wears jeans. Like, what are you talking about? Of course he wears jeans. Like, we raise sheep. Do you think that he feeds the sheep and cleans the sheep shed in his suit and tie? But for this student, they had no context of my dad outside of being a fourth grade teacher in a suit and tie. I know that it's not the same thing. And certainly my dad didn't make $8 million a year teaching school for 35 years. But sometimes we see these players in one place. We see them on the ice. We see the Steven Stamkoses. We see the Spencer Stastneys. We see them on the ice in a jersey with a helmet on. Should be wearing them during warmups. That's a podcast for another day. But we see them in one way. And therefore, we tend to think of them as what they do in their jerseys, in their outfit. And we forget that when you take that off, these guys go home and they have whole lives. I'm not making an excuse for Steven Stamkos about his production last season. I'm telling you that life off of the ice changes dramatically when you have young kids and you make a move like that. And so there may be times where listeners wonder, why aren't you harder on these players? And there are a lot of players, especially after last season, that we should be critical of their due, of their production. But it's also learning to balance the do and the who, their production and their person. And so sometimes it's a tricky line to walk. And so saying all of that, I just really want to encourage you all to listen to this interview with Spencer Stastney. I think it gives such a great perspective on what it is like to be a high profile person who is in a position that demands production and to have a weight on you and what you do with that and how do you walk that out, and also how do you find your joy to do that again. We will see Spencer Stastney at training camp. There was a very good chance we would never see Spencer Stastney skating again. He explains that all in the podcast. He will be back for training camp, and I think he'll be back stronger than ever with just a lighter heart. And it'll be interesting to see what that manifests like, on the ice for the team. But I just think it's really interesting as we spend this offseason talking about Andrew Brunette and Barry Trotz and Steven Stamkos and Spencer Stastney and these players. There are a lot of different perspectives to look at: production and also the person. Just some food for thought. And again, that food for thought is as much for me to chew on as it is for anybody who may be listening. I just think it's kind of an interesting perspective. We are wrapping up our 3 questions about today on Friday. If you didn't catch our earlier episodes, we talked about, again, Barry Trotz. We talked about Andrew Brunette and 3 questions about them. Friends, we all know there are a lot of questions when it comes to the Nashville Predators and next season. Next week, Emma's going to be back joining me. We are going to continue to wrestle with some questions about what next season could look like for the Nashville Predators. It's a little bit of a crapshoot, friends. It's a little bit of a crapshoot, but we're going to dig into it and see if we can clear up some of the muddy water next week when Emma returns. In the meantime, let us know your thoughts on Steven Stamkos' production next year. Do you think he is set up to have a bounce back season? And if you're feeling really brave and you don't have a lot of anxiety about it, leave a comment and let us know, where do you predict his points will be at the end of the season? We'd love to hear from you. You can find the podcast online at LO_Predators as well. You can leave us a note there. You can find my work with Penalty Box Radio. You can find me online at ANK_Mama on Ice as well. Friends, that is going to do it for this week's episodes of the Locked On Predators podcast. We thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day. We will be back next week with all new episodes. Have a great weekend. We'll see you then.